Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here this Friday afternoon for another IHS webinar on a recently published book. Today we are very happy to be joined by Francis Fukuyama, whom I will introduce in just one moment. My name is Bradley Jackson. I'm a senior program officer here at the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University. If you're unfamiliar with IHS, we are an educational nonprofit that works with faculty across the country and indeed the world to discuss some of the most important questions facing the contemporary liberal order. Questions regarding how to build social trust among members of the liberal community, questions about rising polarization, and questions about things like housing and criminal justice reform and the other policy issues that face contemporary liberal governance. And today, we are very pleased to be joined by one of the foremost scholars of these questions, Professor Francis Fukuyama. Francis Fukuyama is the Olivier Nomellini Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He previously taught at the Paul H. Nietzsche School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, as well as at the George Mason University Schar School of Policy and Government. He is the author of many books, including The End of History and the Last Man, Trust, Political Order and Political Decay, and his newest book, which I have right here, Liberalism and Its Discontents, which is out now. This book is one of Professor Fukuyama's shorter books. It's only about 150 pages, but let me tell you, it is absolutely packed with ideas. And we're going to be discussing some of those ideas today. If you have any questions for Professor Fukuyama, you will be able to ask them by looking toward the bottom of your screen and clicking on the Q&A icon. You'll be able to type your question there, and we'll be getting to as many of those as we can in the last 15 minutes of the program today. So with all of that out of the way, Professor Fukuyama, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Thanks very much. It's great to be back in front of a George Mason audience. I had a great time teaching there in the late 1990s, and so I'm happy to join you.
Wonderful. So I'm really excited to dig into some of the really interesting ideas in this book and the kind of solutions that you propose for solving or addressing some of the difficulties currently facing liberalism. But let's begin, as your book does, by setting down some of the terms and understanding what we mean when we're talking about liberalism. So the first chapter of your book is titled, What is Classical Liberalism? To help us to understand what the topic of the book is. So could we start there, and could you say a few words about what classical liberalism is and how we should understand this word that has so many different definitions and so many different connotations?
Sure. So a couple of things that I don't mean by liberalism. One is the way it's used in the United States is basically left of center progressive politics, because I think a lot of people in that camp have actually become illiberal in recent years. In Europe, liberalism is usually a center-right pro-market party like the German Free Democrats, and that's not my definition either. I go back to the origins of liberalism in the middle of the 17th century, when liberal writers, reacting to the wars of religion that had taken place in Europe over the previous 150 years, began arguing in favor of a political system that lowered the horizons of politics, not to seek the good life as defined by a religious creed, but simply to protect life itself. A system in which tolerance would be the chief virtue so that people could live peacefully with one another. And that system was institutionally associated with a strong rule of law that put limits on the power of the government. It was associated with constitutional provisions that provided checks and balances on executive power, all in the interest of protecting the rights of individuals. And I think classical liberals also understood that human beings are fundamentally equal in those rights. They don't vary by culture, by nationality. All human beings, have that same set of rights and deserve the same degree of protection of those rights. So that's what I mean by it. I think that, some people use classical liberalism to refer to a more libertarian position that has economic connotations. So that would be a minimal state, minimal regulation, minimal state intervention in the economy. I don't particularly use that understanding of it, because I think that, social democratic Sweden and Denmark, although they tax, at very high rates, are, in my definition, still classically liberal, because they do provide these protections of individual rights, including the right of private property. And therefore, I consider them to be also liberal states in that older sense of the word.
Thank you. So one aspect of the definition of classical liberalism that you offer in this chapter has to do with it being a humane philosophy. And since we're at the Institute for Humane Studies, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the humanity of liberalism and how that's characteristic of the ideology or the set of
Sure,
ideas in your point of view.
sure. So, there are different justifications for liberalism. So in a way, I kind of outlined the pragmatic one, which is it's a way of governing diverse societies where people differ by religious sect or by, national origin, this sort of thing. But there's also a moral dimension to liberalism, which has to do with human autonomy. In my view, this is deeply embedded in the whole Judeo-Christian tradition. So Adam and Eve are cast out of the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis because they disobey God's command not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that represents a really important juncture, because although they make the wrong decision with regard to God's law, they show that they actually have the capacity for moral choice. They can distinguish between right and wrong. They may make the wrong choice, but they can actually choose. So they have this fundamental moral autonomy. And I think that in the liberal tradition, it's the protection of that autonomy that is the fundamental thing that makes it humane. So we all differ, in terms of intelligence, skin color, height, gender, a lot of different things. But what makes us fundamentally human beings is that capacity for choice. And that's what a liberal regime really protects, who we're going to marry, what we're going to do in life, what we believe, what we say, who we associate with. These are all aspects of autonomy that in a liberal society, constitute the core of what it means to be a human being.
So the next move you make in your book, as you're taking us through contemporary discourse, is to distinguish classical liberalism from another word that gets thrown around a lot with a wide set of connotations, which is neoliberalism. So could you describe what you mean by neoliberalism and maybe distinguish it from the other contending definitions or points of view, and say a little bit about what it is you're distinguishing it from and what work it's doing in your
Sure.
book?
Yeah, so a lot of people on the left use neoliberalism as a synonym for capitalism. That's not my definition of it, because I just think that if you don't have a free market economy that protects private property, you don't have growth, you don't have, economic prosperity. Neoliberalism, as I'm using it, really refers to, the extension of market principles beyond, in my opinion, what they could really bear. In the 1970s and 80s, it was associated with the rise of politicians like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher that basically, in a way, saw the state as the primary enemy, that you needed to privatize and deregulate. A lot of that was a necessary agenda because, in fact, many Western economies were overregulated at that point. But I think that there was a kind of absolutism about the superiority of markets and the inferiority of states that led to excesses. And so I think what we've seen, especially in Britain and the United States, the two kind of leading neoliberal pioneers, was a huge increase in Gini coefficients over this period, increasing inequality. You have a globalized world in which corporations seeking the most minute efficiency advantage move production from one place to another, that has a devastating effect on working class communities back in the United States. And then, the deregulation agenda, which in many respects was very overdue, gets applied to the financial sector, where, in my view, it leads directly to the subprime crisis. I mean, not just the subprime crisis, but you had you didn't have currency crises really up until the early 1990s when this deregulation move started. And then all of a sudden you got a big series of them: the sterling crisis, the Asian financial crisis, Argentina, Russia, and then culminating in the 2008 subprime crisis, which I think was the product of the failure to adequately regulate the financial sector. And that whole sequence of events, I think, had big political consequences because, the subprime crisis took away the homes of millions of Americans, kind of middle-class Americans. The people that designed that system did well. They recovered after a very short period of time. And I think that the populism that we've seen both on the right and the left of those working class people was driven, very heavily by the kinds of inequalities that that approach to public policy had, engendered. And it's led to some very interesting results because now you've got a bunch of conservative thinkers that now actually have broken with free market economics. They don't like free markets because of these effects, and they're saying in principle that the state ought to get back and regulate more strongly and so forth. And so that's the sequence of events, I think, that was set off by this shift to kind of Chicago school economics.
So that puts me in mind of an old economics joke, which I certainly can't take credit for, but it's something like this: that the Keynesians say markets fail, therefore we must rely on governments. The Chicago school says government fails, therefore we must rely on markets. Whereas the Virginia school at George Mason University of Public Choice said governments and markets fail, but all things equal, you're better relying on markets. In part because they don't have the sort of strong fiat powers of government. They can't create monopoly out of whole cloth like a government can. So I wonder if you could respond to basically the premise of that joke, which
sure.
is that even if we might not want full markets sovereignty, we're still easy. It's smarter for us to rely on markets than to rely on the power of government to organize our economic lives.
Yeah, well, so look, I think that really depends on the quality of government. This is something I've thought a lot about. My political order book stemmed from this realization that political scientists didn't really understand the state very well and where it came from. And, in a sense, how critical the state was to creating a rule of law and the basic framework for interaction. And the quality of states varies tremendously. So, the typical more libertarian critique of government failure says that governments are subject to capture, to corruption, to politicization. And, I think if you look at the experience of different countries around the world, that is frequently true, but it really depends on the quality of the government and the kind of institutional setup. So, for example, all of the fast developers in East Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, now China, all have much higher levels of government intervention in markets than the United States or Britain, more classically liberal, classically in the sense of small government liberal states, and yet they achieved among the highest, economic growth rates in human history. And it wasn't the question of government or no government. It was the fact that all of these countries had a long tradition of pretty apolitical, highly professionalized bureaucracy. And so in Japan, it was the finance ministry of MITI. I mean, you had economic planning agencies in Korea and all these countries that were relatively shielded from, short-term political pressures. The one example of this that I remember very distinctly is that Japan actually had a large coal industry back in the 1950s. And the government just shut it down because they said, we have no business digging coal. And, it led to, 500,000 people being laid off and so forth. You don't hear about this because in that society, the government had the kind of authority to do that sort of thing. In Britain, Margaret Thatcher, one of her big battles was with Scargill and the coal miners union. She did the same thing in Britain, but it was much noisier because, Britain is a much more, in a way, much less deferential to authority. But the point is that, in certain countries, you do have high quality, very technocratic government that can intervene in ways that would not be possible in a more, it's not exactly democratic, but in a country that didn't respect that kind of authority to the same extent. And so if you had the equivalent of MITI, the old Japanese Ministry of Industry and Trade in the United States, that was responsible for protecting strategic industries, it probably would have declared the shoe industry in the Carolinas as a strategic industry that needed protection, simply being captured by those interest groups. Whereas, in a lot of Asian countries, you actually could make a decision like that based on, kind of real, kind of professional anticipation of what the growth path was going to be and which industries needed to be sunsetted, which needed to be supported. So I accept the fact that, in this country, maybe it's a better idea to trust markets than governments, but I don't think that's a kind of universal rule that would apply everywhere.
So the next set of argumentative moves you make in the book takes off from this kind of description of neoliberalism and talks about our understandings of individualism and the self, and locates some of the problems that we're seeing within contemporary liberalism in, let's call it, a misunderstanding of the self. So could you talk a little bit more about that for us, please?
Yeah, so liberals care about individuals. They vest rights in individuals and not in the groups that individuals are members of. And one of the critiques that's made more by people on the left than on the right is that that's wrong, that people are basically social creatures and members of groups, and it's that social orientation that needs to be fostered. My view of this is that, it's not an either or, that people both have individual interests and they respond to individual incentives, but they're also just, social creatures from the get-go. And you could see this during COVID, where, people were prevented from socializing with one another, and they felt miserable about this, because I just think there's these very strong human inclinations to conform to group norms, to socialize, to, behave altruistically towards a certain, circle of people, and to follow the norms that support that. So both the individualistic and the social side are important. I trace this in my political order books, but I actually think that the liberal emphasis on individualism is something that's actually historically contingent, because most societies around the world did not start from an individualistic premise. I mean, most societies were heavily kinship-based. Your primary obligation was to your kin group. Over time, it expands from a small, group of close relatives to a tribal society in which everybody traces ancestry to a common ancestor. But individualism really appears in certain parts of Northern and Western Europe, kind of at the end of the Roman Empire. And, in my account, it actually has very specific origins in rules of inheritance that were set by the Catholic Church that restricted the ability of these large kin groups to keep property within this extended family, and made it much more individualistic, and it prevented cousin marriage, remarriage, divorce. All of these things were meant to support the keeping a property within a very narrow circle of family members. And the origins of the nuclear family and of modern individualism, I think, lie in that break that was made, more than a millennium ago. And so therefore, individualism is historically contingent, but I do think that, it's now become a kind of universal aspiration, because once people are liberated from the tyranny of families, they begin to, it's very hard to go back to that. Anybody that's moved to the big city after living in a small town where you've got a lot of very powerful social norms and your family members are all around you, feels liberated when they go to a city where they can be anonymous and they can do whatever they want, and so forth. And I think, that understanding of the importance of individualism has actually taken root in any society that's modernizing. It's also necessary for modern, market-driven economic growth, because if it's kin groups or the state that determine who you're going to buy and sell from, you're not going to end up with any kind of market efficiency. And so you really do need this individualistic premise for markets to work. So this is all a long-winded way of saying that, I agree with the historical view that individualism is historically contingent, but I do think that as societies develop and modernize, it becomes more and more rooted in the way that people think about themselves and their lives, and you can't go backwards. We can't go backwards to a kin-based society where everybody's social obligations to their relatives, is a dominant determinant of the way they make decisions in their lives. And therefore, the individualistic premise of modern neoclassical economics applies if you understand that it applies in a sort of very specific sphere of economic transactions, but you can't forget that powerful social aspect of human nature that also makes human beings conform and behave according to group norms and the like.
So it's on this basis that you then go on to talk about some of the criticisms that we see from coming at liberalism from both the left and the right. And you begin with a discussion of the critique of rationality itself, which was primarily developed on the left, but we can also, of course, see it in more right-wing thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche and others. So could you talk a little bit about this critique of rationality and the way in which that in particular undermines liberalism?
Yeah, sure. So the critique of rationality develops, mostly in this line of thought that goes from French structuralism to post-structuralism to postmodernism, and then hence to, the different branches of critical theory. I know this line of thought very well because I actually went to Paris, for a while after college and studied with Derrida and Roland Barthes, and I actually met Michel Foucault when I was an undergraduate at Cornell. But essentially, it begins with a premise of kind of the centrality of subjectivity, that language is not simply a reflection of an objective reality, but it's something that the speaker of the language imposes, a structure that is imposed on reality and that therefore shapes reality. This is broadened into a critique that really comes to a head in Foucault's writing, where he attacks the idea of scientific objectivity. And he does this in a series of critiques of, madness, of homosexuality, of incarceration, where he says that views that ostensibly represent scientific empiricism are actually efforts by existing elites to control other people. And he broadens this into, this concept of biopower, which by the end of his career, he sees as pervading virtually, all aspects of thought. So when somebody claims the authority of the scientist, they're not actually speaking with real empirical authority. They're actually representing a kind of hidden interest of elites that want to manipulate people. And it's really a matter of, it's a way of gaining power in the modern world. And, this explains a lot of things like political correctness, like why are people in university campuses so concerned with pronouns and different uses of language, or why do some people say that just the expression of a certain, derogatory word constitutes violence? I think it really comes out of this tradition that understands language basically as an instrument of power and domination of one group over another. And then, as you've said, it's now drifted over to the extreme right, where, during the COVID epidemic, a lot of right-wing people began making exactly Foucault's argument, that the public health authorities are not real scientists. They're simply elites that are using the language of science to manipulate you. What they really want is power over you. And that's the central issue. So we've now got it from both directions. And then I would say that technology has vastly amplified the degree to which this is a problem, because it's kind of undermined the gatekeepers that used to verify and certify information. That's been wiped away, so anyone can say anything they want on the internet, and that's what leads us into the situation of epistemic relativism, where we can't agree not just on moral values, but on basic, factual information. And that obviously is a big problem for any liberal society.
Let's dive into that last point a little bit more. So I'm wondering about the rationality of political systems in general. It seems to me that there's something fundamentally irrational about a fascist system, which is destructive of the moral character of its people and ultimately of the way of life of its people. Hannah Arendt in The Origins of Totalitarianism and in the Eichmann book in particular, I think makes an argument like this very plain. There are other systems, monarchy comes to mind, which might be perfectly rational, but aren't somehow available to us today as morally legitimate systems. So is liberalism the only rational system such that it requires a rational point of view in order to work? And any move away from rationalism is necessarily a move away from liberalism, or vice versa? Is every move away from liberalism necessarily a move away from rational political order toward a kind of emotionalized, more irrational way of looking at politics? Do you see liberalism and rationality as going together in the modern world?
No, I think that liberalism and rationality go together. The question is whether democracy and rationality go together, right? So liberalism is closely associated with democracy, but it's not the same thing. Liberalism, refers to the structure of law and constitutional constraints that limit state power, but it's not, popular elections. That's, democratic accountability, which is a parallel set of institutions, and it's in that, so you've had, very rational regimes. Like you look at Singapore right now, which is a good example of perhaps an non-democratic liberal regime. They've got a strong rule of law. They put a lot of technocrats in charge of their public policy, and as a result, they've been very successful economically, and they respect, science and so forth. They don't, they don't go for Fukuyama, conspiracy theorizing there, right? And it's not a democratic regime, but it is a liberal one. The problem, I think, that's been very distressing for anybody that believes in liberal democracy, as I do, is that democratic publics are really oftentimes not all that rational. And I think that the phenomenon we've seen is what Jonathan Haidt calls motivated reasoning, where voters do not take in empirical information, process it, make inferences from it, and then choose policies on the basis of that analysis. They start with the conclusions they want, and they use their cognitive powers to gather enough information to justify this pre-existing choice. And you see this kind of over and over again in our politics, where extremely smart people, well-educated people, can take I think ridiculous positions because their motivation for coming up with the conclusion that they started with is so powerful. And so that, I think, is really the problem. It really does come out of democracy more than out of liberalism.
So you also just mentioned technology and the way that technology has made freedom of speech a more difficult proposition to maintain in our world. Could you say a little bit more about technology and the internet
Sure.
and how that's helped to create this crisis of freedom of speech that we've seen over the last 5-6 years?
Yeah, so I think the basic principle of freedom of speech is really fundamental to liberalism, because that, the ability to speak and have opinions is one of the fundamental dimensions of human autonomy. So, it is a basic foundation. The problem, I think, right now that's created by technology is not that it permits all sorts of bad speech, right? Under the First Amendment in the United States, there's no requirement to tell the truth. There's no requirement to not propagate, conspiracy theories, or even hate speech if it's not violent, is permitted. The problem, I think, is really in the ability of certain institutions to amplify or silence certain, types of speech, especially certain types of political speech. And that's a power that governments traditionally have exercised, which is why, freedom of speech in the United States and American jurisprudence really applies only to the government's restriction of speech rights. But what technology has given us, in social media, is the ability of private actors to amplify or silence on a scale and with a speed that is really unprecedented. Now, traditional media like radio, was also used in this fashion. So the rise of Mussolini and Hitler was tied to the rise of, these broadcast media. But the power of social media and the internet platforms right now is, vaster than anything that existed previously, because they're global in scale. They can propagate messages, instantaneously around the world. They can target messages to particular groups in ways that were not possible under legacy media. And so it's that power to shape speech, either by amplifying or, blocking, that is really the problem. And I don't think we've come up with a good solution to doing this, because I think, most everybody would agree that apart from certain, pretty clear limits, the government should not be given that power to determine what's acceptable political speech. I do not think that a private technology company, whose bottom line is really what's driving it, has the legitimacy or the capability to make those decisions. But it's not clear, how you're going to control the flow of this amplified information. And so right now, we're at this point where we've kind of delegated this authority to the platforms, but I don't think that's a long-term solution, and I'm not quite sure what the appropriate solution is.
The next couple chapters in your book, I think, after spending a bit of time with the left-wing critiques of contemporary liberalism, you turn a little bit more to some of the right-wing critiques, but keeping those left-wing critiques present. And one of the questions that you ask there are there alternatives to the liberal order that were somehow missing? What are the things being proposed by the critics of liberalism, and what would life be like were they to prevail? Could you just talk a little bit about those ideas?
Yeah, so there's a number of, a kind of growing number of conservative intellectuals that have tried to come up with alternatives to liberalism. And so, Patrick Deneen wrote a book about why liberalism failed, in which he doesn't just talk about policy failures. He goes after the very essence of liberalism, which is the fact that it doesn't set higher goals for human societies. And he basically wants to go back to a time before the liberal revolution in the 17th century, in which you'd have a broad society-wide consensus on a single definition of the public good, which essentially means going back to something like a state religion, where everybody confesses the same set of beliefs in the final ends of man. Now, this is totally, as far as I'm concerned, just off the scale impossible, that you're not going to get anything like this in the United States. Previously he had argued for what Rod Dreher called the Benedict option, where at least if you're a conservative religious believer, you could retreat into your local community and maintain those, values and norms within that community, which, as far as I'm concerned, is fine. I mean, that's what you do in a liberal society, is you have that right to, to that kind of private belief. But increasingly, I think a number of these conservative thinkers, Catholic integralists and so forth, are not content simply to, push for that kind of religious freedom, but they actually want to put the power of the state behind, a particular religious view. And, you tell me, I mean, how likely is that we're going to restore a state religion in the United States? I think not very likely. So I don't think that that's really much of a viable alternative.
The next chapter in your book, after you talk a little bit about these alternatives, is about nationalism. And so we can see on the one hand, I think pretty clearly in our contemporary environment, as you were just alluding to, a Christian nationalism that's become quite strong, especially on the right, of course. However, you don't want here to throw nationalism out completely. It seems to me that you're trying to create the conditions for what we might think of as a healthy nationalism, a nationalism that is as inclusive of Americans as possible, not making these religious distinctions, for example. So could you talk a bit about nationalism and how it's a
Yeah,
challenge to liberalism that liberalism needs to face somehow?
no, sure. So, on one level, liberalism and nationalism are at odds with one another because liberals believe that all human beings enjoy rights, and it doesn't matter what jurisdiction they're living in. So we should, support the human rights of people in Myanmar, Bangladesh, or wherever they happen to be living. But nations only enforce rules on their own territory for their own citizens, and they make distinctions between citizens and non-citizens. So how do you reconcile this? And I think that's a kind of interesting thing about liberal theory. I don't think that there's actually a theorist that's laid out a theoretical case for why the world should be divided into nations. I think the case is made on kind of realpolitik, grounds of political realism. One of those just has to do with enforcement power, that you can't really have rights unless they're enforced, and they have to be enforced by a state with the whole apparatus of a judiciary and police and so forth. And that kind of authority is necessarily limited because right now it exists in nation states and really does not extend beyond the territorial borders of a nation state. I'm not sure we'd actually want to move into a world in which nations could enforce rights in other countries at their will. Sometimes the United States has been blamed for doing this sort of thing, in its kind of muscular pursuit of human rights in other countries. But I think everybody at this point kind of realizes that if everybody did this around the world, we live in a pretty chaotic world. So, so one practical argument is that enforcement power is a scarce commodity. It is necessary if you're going to have meaningful rights, but it has to be territorially limited to the society that has reached this social compact over the legitimacy of state action. So that's one argument. Second argument is really just an observation about human nature, that people show solidarity not to humanity as a whole, but to much smaller groups of people, beginning with friends and family. And it's really the nation that is the largest unit to which there's a kind of instinctive loyalty. And you need this loyalty because people have to obey the commands of the state and believe in its legitimacy even when the state makes mistakes. So you can't have people constantly deciding from day to day, well, I am going to obey the law today, but I don't like what the state did yesterday, so now I'm not going to obey it, right? You need this sort of instinctive belief in the legitimacy of the society that you live in, and that includes liberal societies. Liberalism is supported not because there are very few people that are willing to die for liberal principles just in the abstract. They die for them as embedded in a particular nation, and in particular their nation. And I think you can see this right now in what's going on in Ukraine, because there's been this unbelievable outpouring of support for Ukraine. Like 250,000 Ukrainians came back to Ukraine after the Russian invasion to defend their country. And so you say, why are they doing this? Are they interested in Ukraine as a liberal democracy, or are they just interested in the sovereignty of this unit called Ukraine? And I think you can't really separate those questions, because they're actually interested in Ukraine that is a liberal democracy. That's the kind of national identity that they're fighting and dying on behalf of. And so it's really only a liberal idea embedded in a concrete nation that's actually going to produce the social cohesion that you need to have a viable society. And therefore, I think liberals should not cede the idea of nation to the extreme right, and they have to maintain a proper liberal understanding of what the nation is. It can't be based on fixed characteristics like race or ethnicity or inherited religion. It has to be something that's accessible to the full diversity of the people that are citizens of the country. And therefore, when Prime Minister Modi in India seeks to change the national identity of his country from a liberal one, the liberal one that had been established by Gandhi and Nehru, that was deliberately not defined in religious terms, to one that's based on Hindu nationalism, it means that the 200 million Muslims in India are all of a sudden disenfranchised, and that is the ground for violence, for internal instability, and it's kind of the reason why you need this kind of liberal sense of nation, which India at one point had, but is in the process of losing. So that's why I think nations remain important, but they have to be liberal nations.
What you were just describing, the need for a set of organizing and unifying principles that somehow transcend immutable characteristics like race or inherited ideas, as you say, like religion, leads us to your final chapter of the book, which is called Principles for a Liberal Society. Because it seems to me that what must be left if we leave out immutable characteristics, if we leave out inherited traditional characteristics such as religion and language, what we're left with is ideas and principles. So could you describe a bit, what are these principles of liberalism that we need to be aware of and commit ourselves to if we're going to maintain a liberal political order? And also, what are the stakes involved if we fail to do that?
Well, I think that a liberal national identity does have to revolve around ideas, and they need to revolve around the ideas of liberalism and democracy itself. And so, you need to believe in a constitutional order, in the importance and centrality of a rule of law, of democratic accountability. It's that set of ideas that, forms the core of liberal national identity. It's what Habermas called Verfassungspatriotismus, constitutional patriotism. However, that by itself produces a pretty thin sense of community. It doesn't, really have the kind of emotional content that is, I think, necessary for a stronger sense of social cohesion. And, in most liberal societies, it's supplemented by other things that come out of the realm of culture. One of the most important is language. So if you think about what French identity has been, it's been challenged in recent years, but what it's been for much of the period since the French Revolution, it's, the political ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity coming out of the revolution, but it's also the French language and a French cultural tradition that includes, food and, attitudes towards the arts and culture, literary tradition and the like. And I think those can remain fundamentally liberal because anyone can learn to speak French and they can participate in that. So, my favorite example of this is Léopold Senghor, this Senegalese poet who was very important in the Negritude movement, who was admitted to the Académie Française because he wrote beautiful, French. And so I think that all liberal societies need a certain thickening of, their identities that remain, fundamentally accessible to everybody, but go beyond just the bare ideas, underlying their constitutional orders. Sometimes it's sports. There's this great movie Invictus about how Nelson Mandela, after the South African transition to democracy, made a big effort to get Black South Africans to root for the Springboks, the national rugby team that at that point was almost all white. There had been a division in the country where the Blacks played soccer and the whites played rugby. And he met a lot of opposition from his fellow Black South Africans who said, why should we root for this racist, sport and so forth. But I think he kind of recognized that, things like sport are exactly these sorts of cultural institutions that thicken people's sense of belonging to the same community, and therefore, was an important part of identity formation. So, that's a kind of long answer to the question of, how you build identity in a liberal society.
So I'd like to turn us now to some of the audience questions, and just a reminder to the audience, if you'd like to ask a question, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can type in your question there. I'd like to begin with this question, which is, in Professor Fukuyama's opinion, what is the major difference between neoliberalism and neoconservatism? Since he cites Reagan and Thatcher as neoliberals, and many Americans would cite them as neoconservatives.
Well, the term neo depends on what decade you're speaking in. I would say that the neoconservatives today are people that are trying to revise Reaganism, because, Reagan was sympathetic to immigration. He liked free trade. He wanted America to play a strong role internationally in supporting other democracies. And these are all policies and ideas that have been rejected by, Trumpian conservatives who are much more nationalistic, more isolationist, and so forth. And so, neoconservatives today would be that type of conservative that's actually rejected Reaganism. Now, a neoconservative back in the days when Reagan was president, would have rejected. I guess we had a term, not neoconservatives, but paleoconservatives back then, who were the conservatives that existed before neoconservatives arose. So anyhow, it's a complicated issue.
Indeed, it is. Next question from an audience member. Your book ends with an endorsement of moderation. Would you please expand a little on the connection between classical liberalism and moderation?
Well, classical liberalism is all about governing diverse societies where people don't agree on things. And therefore, if people follow their deepest passions to the full, they're going to basically not be happy with, this diversity, and they're going to want to impose their views on other people. And that, is deadly in a liberal society that should be built around the virtue of tolerance. So I think that, and I guess the extremism in a way is sort of built into the way a lot of people think about the self, because one of the things that's happened over the past centuries is this belief in an inner self that is the source of authenticity and human happiness that's then being smothered by the social rules that are imposed on that, that self. And so we need to liberate the self so that it can express itself as fully as possible. I was at a high school graduation for my, back in the days when I lived in Northern Virginia, I was at the high school graduation for my son, and Antonin Scalia, who was alive at that time, was the graduation speaker. And he said, usually graduation speakers tell you to follow your passions. Well, Hitler followed his passions, and look at where it got us, right? So I think that that's where moderation kicks in. Sometimes following your passions is not the best course. There's an older tradition that says that moderating your passions will make you a better citizen, will lead to your own personal happiness, and not necessarily the full expression of everything that lies, deeply inside you.
Next question. Is Singapore really liberal in the sense of being dedicated to individual autonomy? If not, is it liberal only in the sense of having a rule of law and a market economy? Those seem like conditions many illiberal authoritarian states might also meet.
So it is primarily in the economic sphere that the rule of law applies to Singapore. Singaporeans do not have political rights, and they don't have full free speech rights. They have a lot of personal autonomy to express opinions. And so, like in a private conversation, at the National University of Singapore, if you want to criticize the prime minister, you can do it, and you're not going to get reported on and sent to jail, but you can't do it publicly. And so there are real limitations on political liberties. But this proceeds in a actually procedural way that outlines the limits of your individual autonomy in a way that liberals would approve of. But it's true that it's perhaps not fair to call Singapore really a liberal state in that political sense.
Next question. The wars of religion were in part spurred by the invention and spread of printing, which allowed the propagation of broadsides that were often quote unquote fake news. It took about 200 years to reestablish authoritative speech. Do we face a similar problem today? Are there any liberal democratic solutions to the problem? And if not, can liberal democratic regimes survive?
Well, that's a good precedent. It did take quite a while. I mean, you could say the same thing about the invention of radio, that facilitated the rise of fascism in the 20th century. And it took a long time to overcome that. I have no idea. I suspect that because all of these older technologies, eventually we figured out a way to live with them, that we're going to figure out a way to live with the internet, but it may take a long time. I had a working group on platform scale at Stanford a couple of years ago, and we thought through this problem of the platform's power to amplify or suppress disfavored speech and what you did about this. We came up with an idea that we called middleware, which is it's a way of inserting market competition into the function of content moderation, because right now the platforms decide what it is you see on their platforms according to algorithms that you do not control, and you don't really even know what they are. If you do a Google search, you don't know why the results that are being given back to you are what they are. And our idea was that if you created a layer of competitive content moderating companies, middleware companies, you would outsource that function, and you would be able to outsource it to a company or an organization that suited your individual choices. So, if you're conservative, you could have a conservative feed. If you were wanted to buy American, you could pick that kind of a middleware provider. If you're a progressive, you'd have your choice. You could turn the dials and knobs and control what you saw in your social media feed. And that's a possibility. I think we're kind of stuck at the business model part of this, because it's not clear, how you would sustain middleware companies given, the power of the platforms. I think you probably would need to have regulation that would force the platforms to share some of their ad revenue. But, it's an idea that other people have had for how to inject competition into a political function that is currently being monopolized by 3 companies.
Next question starts with an observation that is interesting that your book is coming out at the same time that many other authors are working on books addressing similar challenges to liberalism, albeit with unique and distinctive perspectives. Some of which, like Yascha Mounk and Deirdre McCloskey, you are clearly in conversation with in your book. So thinking of this intellectual groundswell, do you see yourself as part of a big tent liberal intellectual community? And if so, do you think it is important for liberals, rightly understood, of these many varieties to find each other in the present moment?
Oh, absolutely. I think that liberals have been on the defensive for the last several years, and a lot of them have actually retreated from liberal principles. So you see this in universities on freedom of speech issues, where there are too many professors and university administrators that are willing to throw the principle of freedom of speech overboard, if students protest or don't like it or complain. And that's bad. I think that people that really do believe in liberal principles need to mobilize. The whole reason I wrote this book is that there's, you just needed a straightforward explanation to somebody that did not grow up as an instinctive liberal, why liberalism is a good thing. And if you don't begin with that idea clearly in your head, then you're not going to support, liberal policies down the road. And there's not been enough of that. So I absolutely think that, people like Yasha or Shika Dalmia, one of your people, we've all been involved in a kind of common struggle to reassert the importance of this liberal center and defend it against people on both the right and the left that have been attacking it in recent years.
Indeed. I'll just say for our audience that Shika is at the Mercatus Center, our sister organization. And while we wish we could take full credit for Shika, we want to also share that credit with the Mercatus Center. Following up on that last question, one of our audience members asks, however philosophically appealing liberalism might be, I wonder how to make it politically appealing in a contemporary context. It seems easier to mobilize people these days with irrationality, exclusion, and anger. How can liberalism mobilize people politically? It seems to be too nice for this mean world.
Well, there's, I guess, two answers to that. There's a positive and a negative response. The negative response is to make people aware of the alternatives to liberalism and how bad they are. And in that sense, I think Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been a useful object lesson, because I think a lot of people in the West just became complacent, that we'd have this liberal order that would protect us. We could criticize it all we wanted to, but nobody would fundamentally try to undermine it. And now you've got one European state attacking another one, and trying to destroy those liberal institutions, and people can see very vividly how bad that is. One of the problems I think we've had is that it's been a long time since anybody has done this. Most people in Eastern Europe did not grow up under communism, and therefore they don't understand, how bad an illiberal dictatorship can be. And so you need to remind them of the illiberal solutions and the fact that these usually lead to disaster. I think that the positive case needs to come through that cultural thickening that I was talking about, and reminding people of the good things of liberalism, because it does produce economic growth, it does produce entrepreneurship, it does produce innovation, it does make people's lives better. And if you look at the classically liberal societies in human history, beginning with the Periclean Athens, but the golden age of the Netherlands in the 17th century, Britain in the 19th century inventing the Industrial Revolution, the United States in the 20th century, the cultural center of the world, because you have this mixture of African Americans and Jewish songwriters and all sorts of other people contributing to a really vibrant American popular culture. These are all things to be proud of. So I'm not quite sure, that's why you need political leaders, which I'm not, but I think you need people to appeal to those positive aspects of liberalism in order to convince people that that's really the way to go for the future.
Thank you very much. And thank you indeed for spending your time with us today and walking our audience through some of these really interesting ideas. And for writing this book, once again, it's Liberalism and Its Discontents by Francis Fukuyama. Wonderful book, jam-packed with ideas despite its small size. Highly recommend it. For those of you who are interested in learning more about classical liberalism and the tradition that undergirds it, I do encourage you to check out the Institute for Humane Studies more at the ihs.org. We have a lot of programs around these ideas. We also have for academics a number of grant programs and other sorts of programs available to help support research on these sorts of questions. So I want to thank everyone for being with us here today. Francis Fukuyama, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it.
Bradley, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.